Good afternoon, dear students. Here we meet again. This is our third class online, and I had a few questions from one of our brothers, Brother Ajin Tommy. He wrote to me by email and wanted to clarify certain things about our two classes. Since I thought they are important questions, let's just go over them and discuss some of the aspects. I do not profess that I know the answers to all your questions. Obviously, we are all limited people, and I make no claim to know everything, but I shall make an honest and sincere attempt to answer your questions, and this is my humble attempt for you. So the first question Brother Ajin Tommy has put forward to me is, he said, you have said the good philosopher should seek death. If I seek death, is there any kind of influence from my free will over my death, or is everything fate? Now, first of all, I did not say that a good philosopher should seek death. I only said that a good philosopher should be open to death. And the reason for that is that when you have an openness to death, you have a complete and radical openness to life. And that openness goes a long way in trying to understand the other person's point of view, and therefore you are likely to be more free, and you are likely to arrive openly at the right conclusion. So that's why it's important to be open. And we all know that we can be open, but we are always afraid of this one thing, that is death. So the ultimate openness is the openness to death. If we have that openness, then we are radically open to life. And I believe that that kind of radical openness allows you to face and meet problems, and you're able to go into little details, and you're more likely to arrive at the right conclusion. So that's the first part. The second part is he says, is there any thing to do with my fate? Now, see, we are people who have some control over our life, but obviously not all control. So if you want to define fate as something that takes away the control from your hand and makes you subject to the circumstances of life, then that is true, because let's look at the COVID-19 problem now. Did anybody ever think that we would have this problem? But we are in it. So it's beyond our control, and we must realize that in life we have some control, and some of it is away from our control. And so there is an element of surrender. There's an element of letting things be that is not ultimately under your control. So that's all I can say there. The second question he says is that you have given the definition of truth by the English legend Shakespeare. There is no right and wrong. Everything is according to the person. Is there objective truth, or philosophy itself is subjective? Now, what Shakespeare says is that there is nothing right or wrong about any perspective. It's only the thinking that makes it so. That's Shakespeare's observation. It is not necessarily our observation or your observation. It is what Shakespeare says. It is not even established in philosophy that what Shakespeare said is true. In fact, there are quite a few different viewpoints here. And somebody says there is relativism, which is what Shakespeare says. In relativism, everything is relative. There is no hard and fast rule. There is no absolutism. There is no absolute truth. Everything is relative. As a part of that philosophy, we have what we call situational ethics. That is, when we take ethical decisions, we take decisions not from any absolute ethical principle, not any principle which is absolutely valid, but from a situation where we look at the aspects of the current situation and take a decision. So that is called situational ethics, and it is very controversial. It is not acceptable to many philosophers. Well, there are also others who are completely given to this kind of situational ethics. Now, as Christians and as people who believe in God, we certainly cannot have too much of relativism, because there are some absolute truths, sacrosanct in our scriptures, which are not negotiable, which are absolute truth laid down by Almighty God Himself. So it is a question of obedience. It is a question of obedience. And St. Paul, I think it is the book of Hebrews, we find that we have not resisted sin to the point of shedding our blood. Remember that. We have not resisted sin to the point of shedding our blood. So what happens is, when we have got that kind of approach to the truth, we take convenient positions. We take convenient positions and we relativize things. And it makes it easy for us to take that stand. So we relativize things, and relativism becomes becomes a legitimate principle. And that's the reason we have many people adhering to relativism. But a true believer is obedient unto death, like Jesus was upon the cross. He was a plain speaker. He said yes when he meant yes. Yesterday's gospel, June the 13th gospel was, Jesus said, say yes when you mean yes, and no when you mean no. So it's a simple obedience that we are expected to have, and we cannot have too much of relativism in our outlook. That is my humble opinion. The third one is, I have seen the epistemological history of the church. Is it necessary to have it here, sir? Since we are the seminarians, it may be useful, but some of us are outsiders. And how is it useful to them? Now, one of the slides that I spoke about last time in the second class was the epistemic history of the church. What I was trying to do there was to relate the content of our faith, which has got the cognitive dimension. And I was trying to say that even in Christianity, the cognitive dimension is important. So in Christianity, the cognitive dimension and the experiential dimension, they're two different things, but they are very important. So I was just trying to say the history of the church has spent a lot of effort and energy trying to establish what the cognitive truths are. For example, the Council of Chalcedon says in 451, it says that Jesus Christ is true man and true God. So very, very Catholic position. We did not know this until Chalcedon said it and called it so. So this is something that the early church fathers in the councils have argued and deliberated upon and come to a conclusion. And this is now an article of our faith. So it's a central dogma of our faith. So the cognitive dimension is very important for us to appreciate and understand. That is what I was trying to do when I was talking about the epistemic history of the church, the cognitive damage to Christianity. Those are the three questions we had from Brother Ajin. I thank him for being so perceptive and being bold enough to ask me some questions. And I hope I have done some justice and brought before you some ideas about philosophy, which has set you thinking. Now let's go to today's class. Today's class, let's pick up from last time. Let's see here. Okay, so that's our last slide of the last class. Okay. If you remember, brothers, this was the last slide in the last class. We said there is basically two types of philosophy: speculative philosophy and analytical philosophy. And speculative philosophy is something that looks about and proposes something new in our search, whereas analytical philosophy is something that goes down to analyze and delve deep into other philosophers. So this is basically the two things, and then we have two subgroups. Let's now move on. We also said that there is the synthetic method and also the other methods which we will be using for our classes. Today, we will start on the 7 philosophical perspectives on education. This forms the core of our lectures, and there will be 7 lectures. I hope I can finish them in 7 classes. Here they are. The first one are the 3 traditional perspectives of philosophy. They are called idealism, naturalism, and Thomistic realism. This comes from Europe, and it comes from the early scholastic age, and from that time onwards, these philosophies have evolved, and they have a bearing on education today, and we will study them one by one. Second, we have 4 contemporary perspectives. They are experimentalism, existentialism, philosophical analysis, and postmodernism. So 3 plus 4, there are 7 perspectives, and we will take them one by one. Let's move ahead now. There's a 3-way approach in these 7 perspectives. First of all, we will sketch the major assumptions of each of them. The major assumptions of reality, that is metaphysics, of knowledge, that is epistemology, and value or principles, that is axiology. And we shall explore the education implications of these assumptions. Each of these implications, as we shall see in the next slide, have got some education implications. We shall evaluate each perspective in regard to its philosophical adequacy, educational appropriateness, and theological acceptability. We are Christians, and we, as I said in the very first class, that we are using philosophy as a handmaiden to theology. Philosophy is at the service of understanding our faith better and our perspectives better, and so we cannot exclude theological perspective from our search. Okay, implications of the assumptions. Metaphysical assumptions have clear implications for educational aims and curricula. So there are a lot of philosophers who have written very beautifully about the aims of education and how the curriculum is to be designed. And these metaphysical assumptions of idealism and naturalism and Thomistic realism, etc., have got something to do with those aims. Then there is epistemological assumptions generate logical consequences for styles of teaching and learning. This is pedagogy. Pedagogy means the process of learning and teaching. And epistemological assumptions of idealism And all these philosophies have got a bearing upon the styles of teaching and learning. And finally, we have the axiological assumptions, which have important ramifications for ethical nurture and aesthetic cultivation of the student. Ethical nurture, the student is a person who has to develop and become sophisticated in making good ethical and moral decisions, as we had discussed in the second class. And the axiological assumptions or the value-based assumptions are very important for inculcating the right ethical outlook for the child. Okay, then we have the metaphysical assumptions of idealism. First of all, reality is composed of minds, ideas, and thinking selves rather than material things. Man is a pure spirit. This is what idealism says. The body does not count for much. It is the spirit of the man. So man is a pure spirit according to idealistic philosophy. Then be cautious with the term idealism, because idealism here does not mean a very ideal person in English. It is not a person with noble values. William Hawking, the philosopher, modern philosopher, has said that it is better to call idealism, the philosophy idealism, as idealism, because we are interested in the world of ideas. So it is the spirit, it is the mind, it is the thinking that we are interested in. We are not interested in the noble aspect of how ideal a situation is or how ideal a person thinks. That's not what we mean by idealism here. Idealism has been endorsed by some of the great philosophers of the world like Immanuel Kant, George Hegel, Shankaracharya, and George Berkeley. These are some of the people over the ages who have knowingly or unknowingly endorsed idealism. And let's see who they are. This is Immanuel Kant, that's George Berkeley, this is Shankaracharya, this is George Hegel, the German philosopher. So we look at what each of them has had to say and how they are important for us in our study of idealism. Let me just put this here. Okay, there we go. George Berkeley was a strong idealist. He said, to be is to be perceived. The very idea of the material world is a donation of the mind. There is no objective world outside the mind. This is a very, very strong idealist position that George Berkeley puts forward. He says, just to be, is to be perceived. That means unless you are perceived, you cannot even be. You are not even there. So there has to be a mind. There has to be a mind to perceive you. So the very idea of the material world is a donation of the mind. There is no objective truth outside the mind. Shankara's dictum. Shankaracharya, the Indian philosopher who is known for many important philosophical statements, made this beautiful dictum it's actually part of Advaita philosophy. It says, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, Jivo Brahmaeva Napara. Brahma Satyam, God is real. Jagat Mithya, the world is a Mithya. Mithya means an illusion. And Jivo Brahmaeva Napara. God and man are one. There is not two. Just, life and man, life and God is one, not two. Napara, not two. So it says here, the same idea that George Berkeley introduces is seconded by Shankaracharya, who says, Jagat Mithya, the world is an illusion. All that you see, what is outside the world is all illusion. It is the mind that matters. Then we have George Hegel, who again says, George Berkeley that was, this is George Hegel who says, I want a thesis. If I'm given a thesis, I will make an antithesis. What is the thesis? A thesis is a strong and well-connected set of ideas. I have a thesis. If you have a thesis, I will make an antithesis. I'll make the opposite of that, and then find reality by resolution of these two opposing aspects. And that is all that is required according to George Hegel. George Hegel says, he's so absolute about the power of the mind that he was accused of the arrogance of reason. Reason alone was enough for George Hegel. And so he wants a thesis, he makes an antithesis, and by resolution of the two, he finds the reality or the truth. Then we have further metaphysical assumptions of idealism. Idealism came to replace skepticism, which had come because of disillusion with religious strife in Europe in the 16th century. In the 16th century, after Martin Luther's assertion, there was a big schism in the church. There was a big breakdown in the vertical split in the church, and its aftermath was a lot of killing and violence in Europe. But people were tired of this after 1 century of fighting. And here comes René Descartes from France, who says, I cannot ascertain anything. There's no need to be so sure about anything. You cannot be very damn sure about anything. Now, I doubt everything. The only thing I cannot doubt is doubt itself. You see, this is a very profound statement which René Descartes makes in France. He says, I doubt everything. The only thing I cannot doubt is doubt itself. How can I doubt doubt? Doubt is doubt. So that is the starting point he begins from. He says, he asks the important metaphysical question, who am I? And then he answers it. He makes it a clear and distinct answer. The word clear and distinct is typically Cartesian. You will hear about it more as you progress more in philosophy. Here, René Descartes says, I am the thinking thing, the res cogitans. I am the thinking thing. Res means thing, and cogitans means thinking. I am the res cogitans, I am the thinking thing. Look at the idealistic philosophy coming again and again here. So he says, he divided the human mind as human person as the mind and body, and called the body the extended thing, res extensa. Res is thing and extensa is extended. So the body is extended and the mind is, I am both the extended mind, extended person, and the thinking thing. So here he says, he gave primacy to the mind and concluded, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Again, this is the idealist position because it gives too much of importance to ideas, mind, thinking, and all those kind of things. So we have here the epistemological assumptions of idealism. Let's see what they are. Immanuel Kant in Germany in the 18th century said, transcendental idealism, the human mind, is the organizing and the unifying factor in all knowledge. The mind, again, the mind, it's always, idealism always focuses on the mind. The human mind is the organizing and the unifying factor in all knowledge. There is an assurance of the possibility of success in the quest for knowledge. This is what this is one of the positive things about idealism. It says, it is possible to obtain success by the quest for knowledge. It's quite a reasonable stand. There are universal and necessary truths ultimately anchored in consciousness, divine or human. There are universal and necessary truths. Our truths are based on divine or human understanding of things. So we have here many axiological assumptions of idealism. Many idealists say that values and principles are absolute and unchanging, and they originate in the divine. Among idealists also, there is a little bit of disagreement, but many idealists say that values and principles are absolute and that they originate in the divine. Let me see here. Yeah. Okay. Kant, however, says that these principles originate in the structure of rationality. Kant gives a lot of importance to the human mind and says these principles cannot originate in the divine. They have to originate in the structure of human rationality. In Kant's view, moral laws are grounded in rationality and they constitute an objective absolute standard. Immanuel Kant says moral laws are grounded in rationality, the human mind, and they constitute an objective absolute standard. Okay, so the general form of the moral law, which Kant calls the categorical imperative, demands our unconditional obedience. What is this categorical imperative? Moral laws reflect what is universally right for all humanity. However, an act does not qualify as morally just because it follows the objective moral law. It must be done with the subjective goodwill. This is a little bit of an important thing about Kantian philosophy. Kant says that there is a categorical imperative. It demands our unconditional obedience. But an act cannot be moral unless it has also got a goodwill behind that act. So that is the subjective goodwill that Immanuel Kant talks about. And then Kant finally says that beauty is not a matter of personal taste, but something that should appeal to the whole human race. So we have always heard of the important idea that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I think that was Shakespeare who said that. But again, here Kant says nothing doing. It's not in the eye of the beholder. It is not what is personally tasteful, but what is universally accepted as beauty. Only that can qualify as beauty. It is not a matter of personal taste. Okay. Idealism's interactions with theology. Now let's see what we find here. Kant would say faith in God is needed to make sense of the moral life. You know, Kant is a very interesting personality. He says, although God's existence cannot be deduced through arguments of speculative theology, rationality must postulate God to give meaning to moral life. So he said, you must make a God. We cannot prove God. We cannot prove God from speculative theology. It is impossible to prove God. But what we can do is we must postulate God. We must make God. We must assume that there is a God. Why? Because that is important for a good moral life. Moral duties should be viewed as divine commands. When we are given a responsibility, that responsibility we owe to the divine. However, this simply would reduce religion to morality. Religion would then exist only to serve the moral life. Moral life is again only in the terrestrial world, whereas we know as believers and as Christians and as Catholics that there is an eternity waiting for us. That eternity has to be taken into account when we look at our daily life. But then if you look at only morality, even an ordinary person who does not believe in God can be moral. And so religion, if it is reduced to that kind of morality, then religion does not have its primacy of position as the link between humanity and divinity. A Kantian thinker would hold that the historical particulars of a religion such as Christianity should be minimized, reinterpreted, or eliminated in order to highlight the universal moral code. It's very, very interesting, important to understand this. Kant says, Immanuel Kant says that the particular details about our gospel or any religious scripture for that matter, with personalities and situations, should not be given too much importance. Instead, only the essence of the value embedded in the gospel should be brought out, and that should form the edifice of learning the moral life. You see how mischievous Kant has become? So, for example, if you want to talk about repentance, you don't have to talk about John the Baptist at all. You will only require to talk about the metaphysics of repentance. This is what he says. It is only the essential aspect of the idea embedded in the scriptures that need to be extracted and lived with. So it is not necessary to hold on to the historical particulars of a religion. Education implications of idealism. We have idealism has a strong intellectual focus. We heard from all the leading philosophers like Kant or Hegel or Shankaracharya or Descartes. All of them have been emphasizing more and more the mind. So idealism has a strong intellectual focus. Okay. It emphasizes sharpening mental skills to develop self-mastery and develop solid mental character. Hegel says, this is what I had alluded to in the previous class, Hegel's statement about education. Hegel says, education is a progressive perfection of humanity from a simple, uncultivated, primitive mind through the hard discipline of labor and toil to the consciousness and exercise of its freedom. This is what Hegel says. Hegel says that education is a progressive perfection of humanity from a simple, uncultivated, primitive mind through hard discipline of labor and toil to the consciousness and exercise of the mind's freedom. Excuse me. So this is what idealism says. It is bent upon focusing and sharpening the mind. This is a recurring theme in idealism. More emphasis on theory and less on hands-on experience like field trips and do-it-yourself projects. Now, in education, we have got emphasis on today's education has got project work, it's got do-it-yourself experimentation, practical aspects, and etc., etc. But idealism would say no, it is more and more important to focus on theory. This is what idealism says. It encourages acquainting with positive models, heroes, and exemplars. Idealism is very important, is very insistent on the aspect of an expert teacher. The teacher takes prime of place in the classroom, according to idealism. So it also looks at positive models, that is, people who are heroes and heroines in society. It uses these models to inculcate to the student certain good moral values. The teacher becomes a role model to help the student attain fuller selfhood. The role model is used by the teacher to mold the character of the student and to aspire to become like that role model by the student so that he or she, the student, achieves fuller selfhood. The teacher is responsible to create the right climate and socio-psychological environment in the classroom. The teacher is very important in the idealistic classroom, and he or she has to maintain the right social atmosphere, the psychological atmosphere in the classroom. Evaluating idealism. Let's see what the strengths and weaknesses are. Strengths of idealism. It recognizes the importance of intellectual rigor in the development of the human person. Intellectual exercise is very, very important, and it recognizes the importance of doing that. Idealism is very, very strong on developing the intellect of the student. It recognizes the existence of the supreme being. There is a God, although Kant says that it is to be postulated, but idealism believes there's a God, there are absolute values. It believes in eternal principles, the certain eternal principles in the mind of God, idealism believes. It gives importance to theory, which is important in times of declining educational standard. Now, remember, now we have come to a very different way of classroom life. About 40, 50 years ago, everything was drilled into us. There was a need to memorize things. We had to write on ordinary materials. But today, everything is visually focused. So, for example, there is a multimedia experience. There is a PowerPoint presentation. And all these things, in a certain way, take us away from the intellectual rigor required in the classroom. We become lazy in our minds. It gives importance theory, but education in idealist education gives importance to theory, which is important in times of declining educational standards, such as today. As Max Scheler would say, we are nearly a pure spirit. Man has greater freedom from his immediate habitat and is able to maintain universal openness. What do I mean by this? Now, look at our situation here. We have the internet and we have the computer with us. I want to give you a small example of a situation I faced just 1 month ago. There was a student of mine who called me from Australia, and he wanted some certificate to enable him to get the visa, Australian citizenship, and things like that. So he just made a telephone call, and within 1 day, I prepared this letter and I sent it on my email, and he got it, and he got the citizenship. Look at what Max Scheler says seems to be true. Says, we are nearly a pure spirit. That man, I don't even see him. I don't even have his body with me. He is away, thousands and thousands of miles away from me. Now, he is nearly a pure spirit. Man has greater freedom, and his immediate habitat is able to maintain universal openness. He has got freedom from his immediate habitat. And he does not have to travel from Australia to Bangalore to get this certificate. All he has to do is give me a telephone call. And I do it in lightning speed, and he gets it. So that is an aspect of the human spirit, and human spirit working like so fast across these borders. So Max Scheler here seems to say that seems to be true. We are nearly human spirit in a certain sense. And then we have evaluating idealism, also the weaknesses. Let's see what the weaknesses are. First of all, it claims too much for the mind. Idealism claims too much for the mind. Kant and Berkeley go too far in claiming that reality itself is mental. It is one thing to say that man should understand reality. It is quite another to say that man himself depends on mental abilities, or reality depends on mental abilities. It's quite a different. There's no distinction between the perceiver and the perceived, and it tends to be presumptuous about the powers of the mind. Usually we make a distinction between the observer and the observed, the perceiver and the perceived. But here in idealism, there's no such thing. There's only the perceiver, and the perceived is a sub element of the perceiver. So here we have the situation where we give too much power to the human mind. The supreme being is an intellectual construct devised to exist in a certain philosophical system. It is useful for advancing morality, but does not recognize relational concepts such as grace and redeeming love. This highly intellectualized being only faintly resembles the historical God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, see, the idealism proposes a God, says there's a God, according to Kant, says there's a God, but this God is a highly philosophically structured being. It is not the real God. It is not the God that we think as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, or the God of Jesus Christ. So it's a highly synthesized God. We have also other weaknesses. Kant recommends teaching children only about morality, the value of humanity, and minimal mention of the supreme being. He completely overlooks the great treasure of beautiful biblical stories that would edify the young. Kant does not want any of these biblical stories. He wants only the essence of the ideas, and therefore we will be missing out on many of the beautiful biblical parables and stories that would edify our little children. That's a weakness. Since idealism holds eternal principles over the vacillating world, critics say that it preserves the status quo and resists change. Since there are some eternal principles in idealism, critics say that people hold on to these eternal principles and it makes them resist new ideas and change. Practical aspects of projects is undervalued, although Kant does say that theory and practice go hand in hand. As we saw that it is linking more towards theory and less towards practice. The Word became flesh and therefore assumed full humanity and experienced the material world. Idealism's central claim that all reality is mental cannot stand up to the incarnation. Now, you know, Jesus Christ, the Word became flesh. He entered the material world. He experienced the material world. And when we say that idealism is only a pure spirit, idealism is only thinking, then we come to a situation where idealism cannot stand up to the reality of Jesus Christ's incarnation. That's a fundamental problem. That's all it is. My dear students, I found time to do this much today. Let me see here. We went through the features of the main philosophers of idealism. We went through what their principles are. We went through the implications for education. We also went through the pluses and minuses, the strengths and weaknesses of idealism. I hope it was useful. Please note down your questions and ask me anything that I can be of help to you. Again, remember, I myself am a student. I make no bones about it. I'm very, very open to learning and correction. Sometimes you can do better than me in this very class. And so I look forward to learning from you, and I look forward to your questions and doing my bit to make things clear. Thank you very much. God bless you all. Have a wonderful day.